Dear friends, greetings from my home in Washington, D.C. It is a high honor and a high responsibility to be named a champion of freedom under any circumstances, but the fact that this award comes to me today from EPIC has a special emotional significance. It was exactly 11 years ago, in the spring of 2009, that I was tasked to be the European Parliament's rapporteur on an own initiative report addressing for the first time strengthening security and fundamental freedoms on the internet. This was not yet a legislative process. It was the political guidance of the Parliament to other EU institutions on how to ensure that the overriding principles of data protection, privacy, fundamental rights, and democratic values would apply to the internet as well. That they could and should complement legitimate security considerations as opposed to being trampled by them. If you read what the members of the European Parliament decided back in 2009, you will see in the report the seeds and the thinking behind several seminal pieces of EU legislation that followed, including the General Data Protection Regulation. Now, at the time, this was not an easy task. There were still many governments and companies in Europe, certainly, but even more so in the United States, that viewed with great suspicion efforts to place limits on the powers of law enforcement, especially when it came to fighting terrorism, or companies when it came to collecting, storing, or using personal data unfettered by any legislation. But one relentless watchdog for freedom on this side of the Atlantic, Mark Rottenberg and EPIC, were for us European privacy advocates a constant source of advice and inspiration. I became friends with Mark during those times and have remained since. Hence the very special emotional weight that this award has for me. I never thought back in 2009 that I would one day be able to discuss those issues directly with the US administration and Congress as the European Union ambassador to the United States. But here I am. And frankly, also here is COVID-19, bringing some of these issues again to the forefront. Contact tracing apps will be crucial in reopening, but unless they respect data protection and privacy, and unless they are temporary in nature, they can usher in an age of unprecedented personal surveillance. And that's what the EU guidelines that were recently published on tracing apps and privacy try to take care of. They have those apps to be GDPR compliant, and they can be while still being effective and saving lives. Health apps can now save millions of lives as well, but they can also affect a huge shift from outside the body surveillance to inside the body surveillance, and that means that if not applied correctly, governments or companies could know what we think and how we feel and why we feel and think it even before we do, and that's a problem. And artificial intelligence more broadly needs standards. It has to be human-centric, transparent, and human rights compliant. And if democracies like the United States and Europe do not set those standards, others will for us, and we see this already in China, in Xinjiang, with the repression of the Uyghurs. Now, dear friends, the narrative of the last few years has been how Europe's privacy focus has allegedly driven the transatlantic relationship apart. But maybe, just maybe, it will take COVID to prove once and for all just how wrong that was. Largely because of the tireless work of EPIC, the reality today is that we are all thinking about privacy quite differently than we were a few years back. We've seen, and are continuing to see, every day that Americans want baseline privacy protections, that the status quo is not good enough, and that from California to Capitol Hill, the time is ripe for new actions to improve citizens' trust. And in Europe as well, we are committed to seeing that privacy protection safeguards innovation and competition as well, and both our economies need both. And let me close on a personal note. In my whole life, perhaps affected by the fact that in my young years I was raised under a Greek dictatorship, I was acutely aware that even strong democracies can fall under authoritarian spells. And I became guided in my work by one principle and one caution. The principle: In democracies, it is citizens who are supposed to observe and judge the actions and thoughts of the governments every day, not governments who are supposed to observe and judge the actions and thoughts of their citizens. If we get to that, crisis after crisis, we have flipped democracy on its head. And the caution: in democracies, Big Brother will come not because some authoritarian government will impose it. It will come, if at all, with our consent. And if we get used to salami slicing our rights, crisis after crisis, then there's a clear and present danger we could get there. So, if there is any good that might come from this awful disease, it may be this: a chance to establish more firmly than ever the bond of principles, values, and fundamental rights that binds this transatlantic relationship together and always has. I will keep working for that. Thank you once again for this great honor from the bottom of my heart.